Welcome to Pilgrims Grey Chronicles, folks, where we explore the ancient war behind history, the struggle between light and darkness. That's right. It stretches from the first pages of Scripture to the stories and symbols woven through our world today. So I'm your host, Robert Clark, and each episode we follow the long road together, spoken of by Tolkien in his works, asking questions, digging into history, myth, theology, and the hidden threads that shape the age we live in. Now, if you enjoy the show and the different things that we bring up, I know sometimes we're all over the place, but it's because my mind is all over the place sometimes. And so the best way you can support us is simply share the episode with someone who might find it interesting. If they're a Tolkien fan, if they're paying attention to what's going on in history, if they're paying attention to what's going on biblically, if they know that strange things are going on in the world and we're not getting good answers from normal channels, then come check ours out. You can follow the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and if you like to help keep the lantern lit here, then by all means, at the Pilgrims Grey Inn, you can support the show at Buy Me a Coffee. Pilgrims Grey Chronicles, I've been putting the link in the show. And you're also going to find more episodes, and eventually all of our stuff will be slopped onto our pilgrimsgreychronicles.com. Right now, the website just has your ability to listen to the audio stream and join an email list so that we can send things to you as we grow. And I'm working on that. It's not easy. So let's just jump right into this, right? We're going to be doing a show today on something I've always wanted to study. And some of the things I typed in here, I'd have to say I would change now. For instance, for example, saying that the two blue wizards is Tolkien's greatest unfinished mystery, I don't think is necessarily the case. It's one of them, yes. But as I was digging through his letters and other notes, I would have to say, and by the way, this is our new intro for those who are watching and musically, and I'll put it at the end of the show again by popular request. Others wanted to hear it again at the end of the show. I'll also mix it up sometimes by putting at the end of the show our normal Irish jig music at the end of the show as well. So the Latin, Warriors of Light, for those who haven't guessed the Latin intro yet. I'll also, maybe this episode, I'll also post the Latin lyrics to it so you can get it. Anyway, as I was doing the info on this, I came up with 14 different sections that we're going to be covering for the Blue Wizards. But believe it or not, there's enough information to cover. When you dig through all the letters, all the books, the Silmarillion, unfinished tales, even things in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, there aren't necessarily like 100% this is what it is, but you can figure it out by the names given to them. You can figure it out by the lands mentioned, and just in Tolkien's own writings and musings later in his letters, what he intended for these blue wizards. And so I think you're going to find the show very interesting, but also, again, his greatest unfinished thing, there's the mystery of the Entwives too, eventually, that we're going to cover here as well. So if you want to find out things like that, as well as find out about biblical prophecy, things going on in the world, we cover it all here. And you're going to find out, I don't think you'll ever be bored unless, you're like so many people out there with their black mirrors that can only pay attention to 30-second reels at a time. Then this long form podcast probably won't be for you. But there are plenty of people out there who really enjoy digging deep into a subject and finding out some things. And that's who I'm here for. And to present these things, whether it's just weird creatures in the world, weird events from the Bible, what's going on in our world right now and how it fits with that, or Tolkien stuff, because I'm a Tolkien fan and many of the listeners are as well. And that's what we're going to go get into right now. But out my window, which is what this picture is right here, you can see that we went from 70-degree weather here on our farm in Tennessee to about 2 inches of snow on the ground overnight with 70-mile-an-hour winds bringing in this nastiness. And I just thought you'd find it interesting. I think Tennessee is now on its fifth winter. Sometimes we have seven, just to let you know. That is just Tennessee. And here is an example of our two wizards. Going to have some various artwork throughout this show. So, again, Tolkien has this strange silence, right, in the history of Middle-earth. Most Tolkien fans, of course, you all know the great wizards, Gandalf the Grey, Saruman the White, Radagast the Brown, because their stories were kind of, well, not kind of, they were woven directly into the fate of the ring and the downfall of Sauron. But Tolkien told us that 5 wizards had come to Middle-earth, right? Not 3, 5. It reminds me of the counting for the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch, for those of you familiar with what I'm talking about. So 2 of them simply vanish from the story, right? They're mentioned briefly, they're given names, they're sent on a mission, and then they disappear into the east of the world and are pretty much never seen and heard from again. It's really pretty radical. But Tolkien himself, and again, these are known as the Blue Wizards, and Tolkien himself seemed fascinated by them because across his letters, essays, and later notes, he returned to them several times, as we'll discuss, and each time revealing a little more about who they might have been and what they were sent to do, because he changed his mind. So, and the strange thing is this, the more Tolkien wrote about them, the more mysterious they became. So in one version of the story, of course, you may have heard, they failed, right? In another version, they may have become corrupted. And in Tolkien's final thoughts on the matter, they may have quietly succeeded in a mission so important that without them, the entire War of the Ring might have been lost. And yet Tolkien never finished their story. They remain one of the greatest unfinished threads of Middle-earth. And before we go any further, we need to step back and understand something important. The wizards of Middle-earth were not simply wise old men. We've mentioned this before when I talked about my favorite character, Gandalf, with staffs and long beards, right? In Tolkien's mythology, they were something way older, way more powerful. They were members of a divine order known as the Istari, and their story begins way before the events of the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien explains the nature of these beings in the Silmarillion and later writings. The wizards were not mortal men. They are Maiar, angelic spirits that existed before the shaping of the world, the same order of beings that includes figures like even Sauron himself and the Balrogs that you're familiar with. But the wizards were sent to Middle-earth under very strict rules. They were not allowed to dominate. They were not sent to rule. And they were sent to guide. Tolkien describes the mission very clearly in Unfinished Tales, where he says, the Istari were sent to Middle-earth to aid the free people against Sauron, but they were forbidden to match his power with power. And so that sentence is important because it tells us that the wizards were meant to influence events quietly and to respect the free will of men, almost like counselors or wandering teachers. And for those of you familiar with ancient real life, they sound like the 7 sages pre-flood and even after the flood, helping men to survive afterwards and establish civilization before. And it makes the mission of the Blue Wizards even more intriguing in my book, because while Gandalf spent his time traveling through the West among elves, dwarves, and the familiar kingdoms of men, the Blue Wizards were sent somewhere else entirely, right? They were sent into the East. Ah, yes, their arrival here. Beyond Mordor, into lands Tolkien barely even described, into territories that were already under the influence of Sauron. And then Tolkien stopped telling us what happened to them, but Tolkien did leave us a few clues. And these clues come from scattered places across his writings, like Unfinished Tales, The Peoples of Middle-earth, and notes that were published after his death by his son, Christopher Tolkien. And so these fragments suggest something remarkable, really, in that the Blue Wizards may have been fighting a hidden war. And that's kind of what I believe after doing this study. So a war that took place far from Gondor, from Rivendell, from the Shire, a war fought in the distant east among the nations that eventually marched under Sauron's banner. So if that is true, then the 2 Blue Wizards may have played a role in the defeat of Sauron that Tolkien never fully told. And I wish somebody would. It would be great. They may have prevented entire civilizations from joining his armies. They may have stirred rebellion where Sauron expected obedience. They may have been the reason the West was not utterly overwhelmed. And if that's the case, then two of the most important heroes in the history of Middle-earth may be the ones whose story Tolkien never finished writing. And tonight we're going to follow the trail Tolkien left behind. We'll examine every reference he made to the Blue Wizards, their names, their mission, their possible fate, and the strange possibility that Tolkien believed they were secretly fighting the most important battle in the entire war against Sauron. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones history forgot to record. And that idea is going to become an important theme for the episode, because if you think about it, a lot of people feel that way in the world we're living in right now. I feel that way oftentimes. You know, we're unnoticed, we're unimportant. Like your life doesn't really matter in the grand story of things. Like the real battles are fought by famous names with millions of followers and the spotlight's on them, while the rest of us are just spectators, right? We're not really having much to do with anything. But Tolkien didn't see the world that way. And really, I don't either anymore. I used to kind of, but not anymore. And again in his stories and in the stories of Scripture, the fate of the world turns on the quiet courage of people no one expected or noticed. Hobbits, wanderers, unknown soldiers whose names never make it into songs, right? And in a strange way, the story of the Blue Wizards fits that same pattern, because if Tolkien his later thoughts are right, then two of the most important defenders of Middle-earth may have been fighting their battles way far away in places where the histories were written. No songs were sung about them, really. No chronicles recorded their victories, but their work may have helped save the world all the same, right? And maybe that's not just a theme in Tolkien's mythology. Maybe it's something true about the world we live in as well. Because in every age, there are people fighting quiet battles like yourself, doing the right thing when nobody's even seeing it, standing against darkness in ways history may never record. No one may ever know your name. And yet those unseen acts of courage may matter more than you even realize. So keep that idea in mind as we go through the story tonight, because the Blue Wizards may represent something Tolkien believed very deeply, that the greatest victories in the war against darkness are often won by the people the world never even notices, like yourself. All right. So let's go to section 2 here of 14, like I said. The Astari, the angelic order of wizards. And again, before you can understand fully the Blue Wizards, you have to understand what Tolkien meant by the word wizard. In Middle-earth, a wizard is not just a man who learned magic, like many other, writers. There's something, again, older. They are the Maiar, the Astari, which in the Elvish language means those who know. But that title holds something deeper. The wizards were not originally men at all. As we said, they were the Maiar. The Maiar were angelic spirits who existed before the shaping of the world itself. They were servants of the greater power known as the Valar, who governed the world under the authority of Eru Ilúvatar, the creator of the whole world. And some of the most powerful beings in Tolkien's mythology were Maiar. One of them, of course, that most people are familiar with was Sauron. And that's important to remember, because the Blue Wizards and Sauron actually come from the same order of beings, and they were the same spiritual origin. In Tolkien's mythology, even these angelic beings were not created as just mindless servants. They possessed free will, and that meant they could choose whom they would serve. Some of the Maiar remained faithful to the purpose of the Creator. Others followed a darker path, and the most famous example of that fall is Sauron, who in the earliest ages chose to serve Melkor, the first Dark Lord of Tolkien's legendarium, later known as Morgoth. And Tolkien actually reflected on this idea in one of his letters, where he explained that even the great powers of his mythology were capable of rebellion. He wrote that evil began when a being with great power, quote, turned aside from the purpose for which he was made. In letter 131, where he's discussing the fall of Melkor and those who followed him. And so the wizards weren't simply just divine agents sent to Middle-earth like pieces on a chessboard. They were powerful spiritual beings placed into a dangerous world with a mission and the freedom to either fulfill it or fail. And Tolkien shows us that the freedom carried real consequences, because even among the Istari themselves, not all remained faithful, right? One of them would eventually fall. But their purposes in the world could not have been more different, right? According to Tolkien's writings, by the time the Third Age of Middle-earth began, the Valar could see that Sauron was rising again in power, and that they also understood something important. If they simply intervened directly, sending overwhelming divine power into Middle-earth, they might dominate the world rather than save it. So instead, they chose a different approach. They sent emissaries, messengers, advisors, figures who would walk among the people of Middle-earth rather than rule over them. And Tolkien explains this very clearly in Unfinished Tales, where he says, quote, "The Istari were sent to Middle-earth to aid the free peoples against Sauron, but they were forbidden to match his power with power," as we mentioned. And that restriction is crucial. The wizards were deliberately limited. They were clothed in the bodies of old men. They could feel real weariness, real hunger and pain, and their memories of the West were dimmed. They were not meant to dominate. They were meant to inspire, as we said in our Gandalf episode. They would guide the peoples of Middle-earth, encourage resistance to Sauron, and strengthen the hearts of those who opposed him. But the choice to resist darkness still had to belong to the people themselves. Kind of like God doesn't interfere with our free will. He knows everything and the outcomes of everything, but free will is to be respected above all things. Let's go to our next image here. Aren't they handsome together? They're looking over the sunset over Middle-earth. So Tolkien tells us there were 5 Istari that were sent to Middle-earth, 5 wandering figures who would become known simply as the wizards under various names. And the first was Saruman, whose original name among the Maiar was Kurumo. He was considered the most powerful of the order and was chosen as their leader. And of course, my favorite, the second, was Gandalf, whose true name among the Maiar was Olorin. Tolkien described him as the wisest of them all, though Gandalf was reluctant to go, as we mentioned in our Gandalf episode. In fact, Tolkien writes in Unfinished Tales that Olorin initially hesitated because he feared Sauron. But the Manwë replied that this was precisely the reason why Gandalf should go. And then the third wizard, Radagast the Brown, known among the Maiar as Iwendil. Radagast would become more concerned with the natural world, animals, forest, and growing things than with the affairs of kingdoms, which is kind of cool. I didn't really care for the way they portrayed him in the movies. He seemed like a doddering guy, always getting high on mushrooms, with birds living in his hair. I always saw him as a bit more of a powerful druid-like figure. But anyway, and there were 2 others, and that's who we're talking about tonight. The 2 figures Tolkien mentions only briefly, 2 wizards who wore robes of deep sea blue, and their names were Alatar and Pallando. And unlike the other 3, their story doesn't unfold in the West. Their path leads them somewhere far more mysterious. They were sent east, far beyond the lands that the readers of Tolkien's stories ever see, beyond Mordor, into regions where Sauron's influence had already begun to spread. And from that moment forward, the trail of the Blue Wizards begins to fade into the shadows of Middle-earth, which of course raises an intriguing question. Why would the Valar send 2 of their angelic emissaries into the most dangerous region of the world and then leave their story almost entirely untold? I'm not sure why Tolkien did that, but by the end of this, we're going to come up with some speculation, educated speculation. So that's where the mystery is. The story of the Blue Wizards, it truly begins in the East, right? So section 3, who were they? Let's look at this image here. Again, standing over Middle-earth. And now that we understand, by the way, what an Istari is and what they were, let's just look at them as the Blue Wizards, right? Alatar and Pallando. And strangely enough, for characters sent on such an important mission, Tolkien tells us almost nothing about them in the main narrative of The Lord of the Rings. In fact, most readers never even realize they exist. Pretty much only Tolkien fans are aware of the Blue Wizards. Those who've only watched the movies have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. But if you've read, any of the books or the appendices, you at least have some familiarity with them. So their names appear only briefly in Tolkien's deeper writings, particularly in Unfinished Tales, which is on my bookshelf behind me, where Christopher Tolkien gathered his father's notes about the history of Middle-earth. And in those notes, we find the first real clue about them, where Tolkien writes, quote, in Unfinished Tales, of the Blue Wizards, little was known in the West, and they had no names save Ithrin Luin, which simply means the Blue Wizards in the Sindarin language. So Tolkien immediately tells us something important in that line. Very little was known about them in the West, which means whatever they were doing, it was happening somewhere else, somewhere far away, where anybody who had had contact with them in the West had forgotten them, or they had very little contact. But Tolkien does give us one fascinating detail about how the two wizards were chosen. He explains that Alatar was actually selected first, and Alatar did not go east alone. Instead, Tolkien tells us that Alatar brought another Maya with him. And here's the key passage. In Unfinished Tales, it says, quote, Alatar was sent by Orome, and he took Pallando as a friend, unquote. Now, that one small sentence reveals several important things. First, it tells us which of the Valar chose Alatar. He was sent by Orome. So Orome was the great hunter of the Valar, a powerful guardian who in the earliest ages of the world rode across Middle-earth hunting the servants of darkness. So the fact that Orome himself chose Alatar suggests that something about the mission the Blue Wizards were meant to undertake, right? It was like possibly dangerous, maybe even a kind of spiritual hunt, maybe against the influence of Sauron. I mean, that's speculation just based off of who Orome was. So second, Tolkien tells us that Alatar chose Pallando to accompany him. And that phrase Tolkien uses is very interesting. He says Pallando went as a friend, not as a subordinate or servant, but as a companion, which suggests that these two wizards may have been partners in their mission from the very beginning. And Tolkien gives us one more very intriguing clue, because in another passage from Unfinished Tales, he explains that the Blue Wizards did not remain in the West at all. Instead, he writes, quote, the other two came much earlier, at the same time, probably. I love that Tolkien says probably. It's his own writings, but he's just speculating in his own mind writing. So probably as Glorfindel, when matters became very dangerous in the Second Age. Now that is really interesting, right? Because what that suggests is something very different from the story most Tolkien fans know, including myself before starting the study. People just assume all five wizards arrived together, like our boat image right here. No, wrong one. That they all just arrived on the shore on the boats, possibly at the Grey Havens or whatever, after Beleriand fell into the sea. So it's interesting that the Blue Wizards may have arrived thousands of years earlier in the Second Age, during the time when Sauron was forging the Rings of Power and building his dominion across Middle-earth. So if that is true, then the Blue Wizards may have been operating in the East for almost a millennia, long before Gandalf ever walked the roads of the Shire, long before the War of the Ring, long before most of the history we associate with the Wizards even began. And so if two angelic emissaries from the West were wandering the distant civilizations of Middle-earth for thousands of years, it raises an extraordinary possibility. The history of the East, the lands beyond Mordor, may have been shaped by the quiet influence of two figures whose story Tolkien never really fully told. Two wandering messengers, two unseen guardians, two blue wizards moving through the shadows of history. And that leads us to the next question. If the Blue Wizards were sent east so early, what exactly were they sent there to do? And that is where the mystery we begin to uncover in the next part of the story, section 4. Their names and hidden titles. So up to this point, let's change our image here. All right, Second Age map, sort of. Anyway, we've only been using the names Tolkien readers know, right? Some Tolkien readers, I suppose. Alatar and Pallando. But Tolkien later revisited the story of the Blue Wizards near the end of his life, and when he did, something very interesting happened. He gave them different names entirely. So these names appear in Tolkien's later writings, published after his death in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, where Christopher Tolkien gathered many of his father's unfinished notes, and the names Tolkien recorded were Mor-Inktar and Romestamo. So we have Morink. I'm not sure if there should be a Mor-Inktar and Romestamo. So no, Tolkien never explicitly says which wizard had which name, but the meanings of these titles are extremely revealing. So Mor-Inktar means darkness slayer, and Romestamo means east helper. And those are interesting titles. They sound less like the names of wandering scholars and far more like the titles of figures sent on a very specific mission. In fact, Tolkien gives us a small but very important explanation for these names in one of his notes. He writes that these two wizards were sent, quote, to circumvent Sauron and to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship in the east, the peoples of Middle-earth. That sentence is incredibly important for figuring this out, because it suggests that the Blue Wizards were not simply to wander the east or study distant cultures. They were sent to oppose Sauron directly, but in a very different way from Gandalf. Because remember, Gandalf worked primarily in the west among the kingdoms of Gondor, Rohan, and the peoples already resisting Mordor, or even farther in the west in the Shire, guarding those lands. Of course, we know with the help of the Rangers, the Numenor, so the Blue Wizards were sent somewhere far more dangerous. They were sent among nations that were already under Sauron's influence, among people drawn into what Tolkien calls Melkor worship, the lingering cults and dark traditions that survived from the earliest stages of Middle-earth with Morgoth, Melkor, which means their mission may have looked very different from what we usually imagine when we think of it. Instead of leading armies, they may have been working quietly among distant tribes and kingdoms, turning people away from Sauron's influence, encouraging rebellion against him, and breaking alliances and weakening the foundations of his power in the east. And if that interpretation is correct, the titles Darkness Slayer and East Helper suddenly make way more sense. They weren't conquerors, they were something closer to maybe missionaries behind enemy lines, like Green Beret, causing chaos amongst the evil and chaos. And so messengers sent deep into Sauron's territory, maybe like the 82nd Airborne, to weaken his influence before it could spread westward. And that possibility raises a very important question. If the Blue Wizards were sent to weaken Sauron's power in the east, when exactly did that mission begin? Because when Tolkien revisited their story later in life, he made another change, one that dramatically alters the timeline of their mission. And that discovery takes us to our section 5, a mission that may have begun thousands of years earlier. So let's change this image here. These are lands in the east, possibly, just AI generated images. Oh yeah, how very pleasant. So earlier we touched briefly on something that may be one of the most surprising clues Tolkien ever left about the Blue Wizards, the possibility that they arrived in Middle-earth much earlier than most people realize. So most Tolkien readers assume the wizards arrived somewhere around, I think, year 1000 of the Third Age, give or take. And that's the version of the story most commonly repeated in Tolkien guides and encyclopedias. But when Tolkien revisited this subject later in life, he began to reconsider that timeline. And in those later notes, he began to hint that the Blue Wizards may have come far earlier, maybe during the Second Age, like we mentioned. So that sounds like just a glossed over small detail, like, sometimes you're reading the Bible and you just gloss over this one or two sentences that are just packed with detail. So the Second Age was the time when Sauron was building the foundation of his power across Middle-earth. It was the age when the Rings of Power were forged. It was the age when the kingdom of Numenor rose to greatness. And it was the age when Sauron began extending his influence far beyond Mordor into the east and south. Tolkien makes this clear in several places. In the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, he explains that Sauron had long been working among distant peoples beyond the Western kingdoms, right? In Appendix A, Lord of the Rings, it says, quote, "In the east and south, well nigh all men were under the shadow." And that tells us something important. It tells us that by the time the War of the Ring begins, very large parts of the world beyond Gondor and Rohan had already fallen under Sauron's influence. And Tolkien reinforces this idea later when describing the forces that eventually marched against the West. He writes, quote, "From the east and from the south came many men, and they were strong and cruel." And then those armies, of course, did not appear overnight. They were the result of centuries of influence of Melkor worship spreading outward from Mordor. And that's where the Blue Wizards become incredibly interesting. Because if Tolkien's later notes are correct, and I agree more with it and where he was going with it than previous ideas, if they really arrived during the Second Age, then their mission may have begun precisely when Sauron was first building that influence, not after his empire was already established, but while it was still forming. So that means the Blue Wizards may not have been late arrivals, meant simply to assist Gandalf during the final century of the Third Age, like I used to think. They may have been part of a much longer effort, right? A quiet strategy of the Valar to weaken Sauron's influence far from the lands where the histories of Middle-earth we're all familiar with were written. So 2 wandering emissaries sent into distant civilizations where the shadow was already taking root. And if that was their task, it raises another possibility. The history of the East, the lands beyond Mordor, may have unfolded very different than the history we read in the Chronicles of the West. Because somewhere out there, far beyond the maps that we're mostly familiar with, 2 blue-robed wanderers may have been moving quietly through those lands, working slowly, patiently, trying to prevent the entire east of Middle-earth from falling completely under the dominion of Sauron. If that was their mission, then the next question becomes unavoidable, right? Where exactly did they go? Because the eastern half of Middle-earth was enormous. If you've ever looked at the maps, beyond Far Harad and Rune and so on, Tolkien rarely described it, but he gave a few clues, right? He offered a few that suggested those lands were some of the most dangerous regions in the entire world, which brings us to section 6, the lands of the East. Aren't they delightful? Yeah. So, if the Blue Wizards were sent to counter the growing influence of Sauron, again, where exactly did they go? You look at the map of Middle-earth that appears in The Lord of the Rings, most of the lands, if you're like me, you probably traced it out as a kid. Oh, they were in the Shire. They went through, the Misty Mountains, through Rohan, through this river over here. Oh, there's Gondor at the very edge of that, section over here. And there's Minas Tirith over here on the edge of that mountain. And, oh, Cirith Ungol. You remember all that, and you tracing it as a kid and looking at Mirkwood and the Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. And, I was always fascinated with the maps, right? And if, like I'm looking at the map right now on my laptop down here, my laptop's down here, and I can see that I was telling my brother this the other day, when you look at the map, all of the Western lands, including, my map includes East Beleriand and some of other parts during the First Age. And those areas all have concentrated names of cities, and every river is named. Then you get over here, and when you get past the Wilderland and Mirkwood into Rune, in the Sea of Rune, you have virtually nothing. You have maybe Nefarat, the Great Desert, the Cursed Land, Far Harad, Harad. But like it's very sparse. There's hardly anything named, and very few woods. One mountain range, the Red Mountains up in the northeast. But that's about it. And I wonder if it's not by accident. Tolkien deliberately wrote very little about the eastern regions of Middle-earth. In fact, he once explained in his letters that the stories of Middle-earth were largely written from the perspective of the peoples of the West, meaning that much of the East remained unknown territory to the chroniclers of Gondor and the elves. So we do know a few names. One of the largest regions I just mentioned, Rune, is a vast area surrounding the inland sea of Rune, far to the east and north of Mordor. And throughout Tolkien's histories, the people of Rune are often described as Easterlings, tribes and kingdoms that frequently allied themselves with the Dark Lord. Another region was Khand, a harsh land southeast of Mordor inhabited by warriors known as the Varyags of Khand, who later marched in Sauron's armies during the War of the Ring. I was unaware of that when I first did this study. I knew of the Easterlings and the men of Harad and some other things, but I did not know about the Varyags of Khand. So, and then farther south, you have the enormous lands of Harad, whose people were known as the Haradrim. These were men of the south who rode great war elephants, the ones you see in the movie, and fought alongside Mordor. Tolkien describes these southern armies in The Lord of the Rings. Out of far Harad, black men like half trolls with white eyes and red tongues. Sounds pretty hideous to me. So Tolkien isn't trying to give us a scientific description of those peoples there. He's just basically showing how strange and unfamiliar these armies appeared to the soldiers of Gondor who were facing them in battle. But what matters for our story and timeline here is this. Many of the armies that marched against the West during the War of the Ring came from the East and the South. And Tolkien makes it clear that the influence of the Dark Lords the Dark Lord in those regions stretched back for ages. In the Silmarillion, he writes, quote, Sauron became the greatest and most trusted servant of Morgoth, and in the East and the South he was long feared and obeyed. So that means that long before the War of the Ring, the shadow had already spread across much of the world beyond the Western kingdoms. And Tolkien reinforces this again in The Lord of the Rings Appendix A, where he says, in the East and South, well nigh all men were under the shadow. And again, I've mentioned that before, but that sentence helps us understand why the Valar may have been so concerned about those regions. And if Sauron could unite the vast populations of the East under his rule, then the West would have been hopelessly outnumbered, even more than they already were. But Tolkien also hints that the situation in the East was not completely hopeless, because in one of his letters, he writes in letter 183, quote, not all the peoples of the East were servants of the enemy, unquote. Now, that is another hint. That line opens the door to the possibility, because if some tribes and kingdoms in the East were still resisting Sauron, they would have need of allies, guides, messengers, someone to encourage them to stand against the shadow. And this is where the mission of the Blue Wizards suddenly begins to make sense. You can piece it all together. Instead of sending them to lands already resisting Sauron as Gandalf was sent, the Valar may have sent them directly into the regions where Sauron's influence was strongest, into Rhûn, into Khand, into distant kingdoms far beyond the borders of the maps that we know. Lands where the shadow had already taken root, but where a few tribes may still have resisted. If that was their task, then the Blue Wizards were not simply wandering scholars exploring distant cultures. They were emissaries entering enemy territory. And if Tolkien's later writings are correct, they may have spent centuries there, even 1,000 years, moving among those people, trying to weaken Sauron's influence before it could spread into the West, maybe slowing its spread, encouraging rebellion against Sauron, breaking alliances, helping the few tribes that had not yet fallen completely under the shadow. And if that interpretation is correct, and I think it is, something very interesting begins to emerge, right? Because when the War of the Ring finally arrives, Sauron's armies are large, but they are not as large as they could have been, which raises another possibility. What if the Blue Wizards had already been working in the East for centuries, preventing Sauron from uniting those lands under one banner? What if the war we read about in The Lord of the Rings was only half the story? What if another struggle had been unfolding far beyond the view of the Chronicles of Gondor? A quieter, unchronicled war, slower, hidden, being fought by two wandering figures in blue robes. And if that is true, then the Blue Wizards may have been fighting one of the most important battles in the history of Middle-earth, a battle Tolkien never really fully recorded, which leads us into the next part of the mystery, because not everyone believed the Blue Wizards succeeded in their mission. In fact, Tolkien himself once suggested something far darker. Here in section 7, at first, the Blue Wizards failed. But, we've been discussing up until this point that the Blue Wizards, sounded hopeful, and they were two emissaries sent into distant lands and two wandering figures working quietly to weaken the influence of Sauron in regions already under shadow. But Tolkien didn't always view their mission that way. In fact, in some of his early writings, he suggested something darker. At one point, believed the Blue Wizards may have failed their mission, and not just failed, they may have even become part of the problem they were sent to solve. Christopher Tolkien records this early interpretation in Unfinished Tales, where his father speculated about what might have happened to the two wizards who vanished into the east. He explains that the Blue Wizards passed out of knowledge and were rarely mentioned again in the histories of the West. Then he adds a striking possibility. Quote, I fear that they failed and that they became founders or beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. And that was in Unfinished Tales. And that, it's a remarkable idea, because if Tolkien's early speculation were true, the Blue Wizards would not be remembered as hidden heroes. They would be remembered as figures who slowly drifted away from their mission, powerful beings who entered lands steeped in darkness and eventually became entangled in the very systems they were meant to oppose. And when we remember what we discussed earlier about the free will of the Maiar, well, that possibility becomes much more believable, right? I mean, we think of Saruman, right? Sauron himself had once been a Maya, and Saruman, the leader of the Istari, eventually fell into corruption as well. So Tolkien clearly believed that even these powerful spiritual beings were capable of failure, which means the Blue Wizards entering the distant land and shadow-filled civilizations of the East would have faced enormous temptation. You can see the pictures of the worship of Melkor here if you're watching the audio version or video version of the podcast. So you imagine centuries passing, civilizations rising, falling, powerful rulers seeking their counsel, mysteries and cult traditions forming around their presence. It's really not difficult to imagine with that kind of power they could have had. Two wandering figures of great knowledge and power could gradually become something very different from what they were supposed to be. Maybe leaders, teachers, and even objects of reverence among the people they encountered. And over time, the original purpose of their mission might slowly fade, right? Instead of weakening the shadow, they might unknowingly create new traditions of magic or mystery that survived long after Sauron himself was defeated. And that was Tolkien's early theory. But he didn't leave the story there, because later in his life, like I said, he reconsidered the fate of the Blue Wizards. And when he revisited the question again, he began to suggest something very different, something that completely reversed the darker interpretation. And if his later thoughts are correct, then the Blue Wizards may not have failed at all. They may have succeeded in a way that no one in the West ever realized. And that takes us into section 8, Tolkien changing his mind. And now we have an image on the screen here of the two wizards lecturing the men of the East, holding up the Eye of Sauron. Almost like Paul, speaking to the Romans. So, thankfully, in my opinion, and you're welcome to share your opinion in the comments if you feel like his first interpretation makes more sense or was better. I like the second one because I'm a person of hope. So he didn't leave it there, right? Not in the dark place. He continued revisiting the history of Middle-earth later in life. He began reconsidering their fate. And when he returned to the subject again in his later writings, he suggested something very different. Instead of falling into corruption, they may have quietly succeeded, right? Like we said, in the peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien said that their task was to circumvent Sauron and to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship and to stir up rebellion against him, right? So instead of becoming founders of cults, Tolkien now suggested that they were actively working against Sauron from within territories he controlled, helping those who resisted him and encouraging rebellion against his rule. And I like that interpretation because to me, it makes more sense with the way Tolkien is and the way he wrote, right? Because Sauron's power did not come only from Mordor. His strength came from the vast populations of men in the East, his orcs, the beasts that followed him, and men from the South who eventually marched under his banner during the War of the Ring, right? You have the Easterlings, Haradrim, and the Varegs of Khand that we mentioned. And again, I didn't know that much about Khand, but when I read about it, I discovered it was a rugged land southeast of Mordor, and the Varyogs were described as fierce warriors who served Sauron during the War of the Ring. Tolkien mentions them briefly among the armies gathered by the Dark Lord, but he never really expands much on their culture or history. They're just one of many examples of distant peoples who had fallen under Sauron's influence. But if the entire East had truly been united under Sauron's rule, those armies would likely have been, again, way larger. Gondor and Rohan may not have survived it at all. You know, they had a hard enough time with what they had to face already. Could you imagine if there hadn't been any opposition at all in the East? So I personally think that the Blue Wizards were sent to prevent that from happening. That their mission was not to defeat Sauron directly, but to fracture his alliance before they could become utterly unstoppable and just sweep over the entire West. And if that was their task, then the Blue Wizards were fighting a very different kind of war. Not the visible war of armies and great battles that we read about in Lord of the Rings, but maybe a quieter struggle, fought through influence, persuasion, and the turning of hearts. There might not have been wars fought there, but maybe many of the men refused to join the ranks of the armies and instead hid out, or did things to subvert those armies, maybe ruining supply lines, guerrilla warfare type things. So while Gandalf was guiding resistance in the West, the Blue Wizards may have been doing something similar in the East. And if Tolkien's later interpretation is correct, their work may have been incredibly important. And if they even succeeded partially and prevented large regions of the East from falling completely under Sauron's control, that could have played a huge hidden role in the eventual defeat of the Dark Lord. Their victories simply would not have been recorded, right, in the histories written in Gondor. How could they be? So it fits perfectly with something Tolkien loved to emphasize throughout his stories, that some of the most important acts of courage happen far from the places where history is written, like we mentioned at the beginning of the show. And that brings us to an even deeper clue, because Tolkien eventually gave the Blue Wizards new names, right? The ones we mentioned earlier. And those names give us the next piece of the journey. They're secret names. Tolkien revisited the story of the Blue Wizards later in his life. He didn't just reconsider their mission. He also gave them new names. And most fans know, again, the Blue Wizards by the names Alatar and Pallando. And those names appear in the Unfinished Tales and other writings described in the order of the Astari. But in Tolkien's later notes, he introduces these names, Morin Catar and Romestamo. Again, Darkness Slayer and Eastern Helper. They're not the kinds of titles one would expect for wizards who failed and disappeared into corruption, right? And that's why I mentioned them again. See, we have new allies in the East here. And I think that's important, right? We have this inner working within the territories influenced by Sauron, helping those who resisted him and weakening his influence from within. Not these great conquerors or rulers, but catalysts encouraging rebellion and supporting the tribes that refuse the shadow and preventing the complete domination of the East. So I think that is the correct interpretation. And they're just not just wandering aimlessly to distant lands. They were on a very specific mission given to them by Orome, and one that may have lasted centuries, quietly subverting, year after year, because if Tolkien's later timeline is correct, they may have arrived again during the Second Age and continued working quietly all throughout that and into the Third Age. And so the possibility here is that when you look again at the War of the Ring, something becomes pretty clear. Sauron's armies are large, but not as limitless as they could have been, right? If the Blue Wizards were working in the East for centuries, what were they preventing? Well, because the armies we see in the Lord of the Rings may represent only a fraction of what Sauron had hoped to command, the possibility leads directly into the next part of our mystery here, which is the idea that while Gandalf was fighting the war we know in the West, another struggle may have been unfolding beyond that map. This hidden war we're talking about, one Tolkien never really fully wrote down, right? So by this point in the story, we've got this possible hidden war in the East. If the Blue Wizards were sent east to weaken Sauron's influence, and if they were helping tribes resisting Melkor worship, then they may have been involved in that struggle that Tolkien never really fully described. So when most readers think about the conflict against Sauron, they think about the events we see, with, my favorite writing, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, right? The Fellowship, the Battle of Helm's Deep, Pelennor Fields, the destruction of the ring. But those events take place almost entirely in the western lands of Middle-earth. And Tolkien reminds us that the world beyond those regions was enormous, right? The Far East, Rhûn, way beyond Mordor. Yes, the hidden war in the East. So in The Lord of the Rings, there's a quote that says, "From the East and from the South came many men, and they were strong and cruel. But even as large as those armies were, they may not represent the full strength of the East. Because if Sauron had completely unified the East and the Southlands under his rule, the armies marching against Gondor could have been like an ocean, way larger. I mean, it was already depressing enough reading as it is, right? It seemed hopeless. But imagine 5 times that army, large enough to overrun the entire West, right? But what if something prevented that unity? What if the peoples of the East were not as completely loyal to Sauron as he'd hoped? Because of the influence, right? This is where, again, in the peoples of Middle-earth, it says, quote, their task was to circumvent Sauron, right? So that, again, that sentence I've quoted a couple of times here. The Blue Wizards weren't simply observing the East, they were actively disrupting Sauron's influence there. And if they were doing that work for centuries, the consequence could have been enormous, right? Instead of one unified Eastern Empire marching west under Sauron's command, the East may have remained fractured, divided, fragmented, and unstable, and too fractured to mobilize its full strength against Gondor, which means the Blue Wizards, they've been fighting a very different kind of war. Not the dramatic battles recorded, chronicled in the West, but a slower conflict fought through influence and persuasion and the quiet turning of hearts, convincing tribes not to join Sauron, turning rival kingdoms maybe against one another, civil war, encouraging resistance where it could have been found, right? So in other words, while Gandalf, again, was guiding the resistance in the West, the Blue Wizards may have been quietly weakening the shadow in the East. And if even a portion of Tolkien's later theory is correct, their work may have played a hidden role in the final defeat of Sauron. Because sometimes victory doesn't come from a single decisive battle, right? As, seems to be indicated in Pelennor Fields and in that final one before the Gates of Mordor. Sometimes it comes from 100 other smaller victories that no historian ever writes down. And if that is the case in Middle-earth, then somewhere far beyond the lands of Gondor and the Shire, we had those 2 blue-robed wanderers that may have spent centuries fighting a war that no one in the West ever saw, and they never really got credit for. And if their mission lasted that long, what eventually happened to them, right? Tolkien never really clearly shows us how the story of the Blue Wizards ended, and that mystery takes us to the next part of our investigation, the civilizations of the East. Let's go to that image. Yeah, a couple camels, Eastern-looking buildings. Tolkien hinted many times that the lands beyond Mordor were vast and filled with civilizations that simply never appear in the main narrative of The Lord of the Rings. A part of this comes from Tolkien's method of storytelling. The events we read about are largely recorded from the perspective of the West. He tells us this: the elves of Rivendell and Lindon, the kingdom of Gondor, and the peoples of the Shire, and beyond those lands stretch enormous territories that the historians of the West barely understood. And so Tolkien also drew inspiration for these distant regions from the real world cultures. Scholars have often pointed out that the eastern regions of Middle-earth echo elements of Persian empires, Central Asian steppe cultures, and the great trade routes of the Silk Road. Vast networks of cities, tribes, caravans, and kingdoms stretching far beyond the lands familiar to the peoples of Gondor. And that helps explain something important. The east of Middle-earth was not just a wilderness filled with scattered tribes, it was likely a place that contained large and ancient civilizations, right? Cities, trade routes, kingdoms, and entire cultures with their own histories and traditions. And you can catch a brief glimpse of this in Tolkien's descriptions of the Easterlings and the Haradrim. They were portrayed not merely as wandering warriors, but as peoples from distant lands with long histories of their own that Tolkien never fully explored, those regions in his stories. And it leaves us with a interesting implication. If the Blue Wizards were sent into the East, they may have spent centuries traveling through vast civilizations Tolkien never wrote about, cities whose names we don't know, kingdoms that never appear on the maps, you know, uh, tribes and rulers who may have encountered these strange blue robed wanderers from the west. So you imagine these two emissaries of the Valar moving quietly among the great trade routes of Middle Earth, crossing deserts, crossing mountain ranges, passing through ancient cities. I mean, they had over 1,000 years to do it, right? Whose stories were never recorded in the Red Book of Westmarch. So if Tolkien's later interpretation is correct, they weren't, again, just wandering through empty lands. They were moving through the heart of the civilization, through, the Silk Road trade routes, the heart of these civilizations that Sauron hoped to dominate. So if those civilizations were large and powerful enough, they could have supplied Sauron with armies, again, far greater than anything Gondor had ever faced or seen during the War of the Ring, which means the work of the Blue Wizards in those lands may have been far more important than anyone in the West ever realized or spoke of. And again, then we see how much unexplored history lies beyond the map of the West. We have to ask the obvious: why didn't Tolkien ever finish the story of the Blue Wizards? And why leave such an enormous mystery unresolved? And so let's talk about that in our 12th section. We're almost finished here. If the Blue Wizards may have played such an important role in the struggle against Sauron, why didn't Tolkien ever finish the story? Why leave such a fascinating thread unresolved? And part of the answer lies in how Tolkien structured his world. The stories we read about in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are written largely from the perspective of the West, right? The lands of the Shire, Rivendell, Rohan, and Gondor. And these are the regions which whose histories were preserved in the records that eventually became known as the Red Book of Westmarch, the fictional source Tolkien often described as the origin of the story. So Tolkien deliberately designed Middle-earth so that the world would feel larger than the story being told just in the Red Book of Westmarch. So there would always be places beyond the map, people beyond the chronicles, mysteries that characters themselves did not fully understand. And the Blue Wizards are obviously one of those mysteries. In fact, Tolkien used this technique throughout his legendarium. Some of the most intriguing elements of Middle-earth are never fully explained. I think it's cool that he does that. For example, there's Tom Bombadil, the strange and ancient figure who lives in the old forest and seems untouched by the power of the ring. And Tolkien never really fully explains who or what Bombadil is. My son did a college paper on him and still couldn't 100% say for certain. So there's also the Watcher in the Water, the mysterious creature outside the gates of Moria that appears briefly and then disappears back into darkness. And deeper still are the creatures Gandalf refers to beneath the earth when he speaks of the ancient tunnels under Moria, right? He says, quote, "Far, far below, the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things." But Tolkien never tells us what those nameless things are, so they remain nameless, right? And that's intentional, because Tolkien believed that a mythic world should always contain unknown depths, places where the imagination of the reader continues the story, so you can use your own imagination and escape, right? I love that. So the Blue Wizards fit perfectly into that same pattern. They are figures who clearly played some role in the great struggle against Sauron, yet their story unfolds far from the lands that are commonly known in the main chronicles of Middle-earth. And so it means their deeds, whatever they were, may simply have passed out of memory of the West. And that brings us back to the central mystery. If their story was never recorded, what might actually have happened to them? Because Tolkien leaves us with several intriguing possibilities. And those possibilities form the final pieces of the puzzle. And that leads us to section 13. What may have happened to them? Well, after examining Tolkien's notes, he never really tells us how their story ends. He leaves us with a few possibilities. One is that the Blue Wizards died in the East, maybe during a conflict with forces loyal to Sauron. If they were encouraging rebellion among tribes already under the shadow, their work would have put them in constant danger. Another possibility is that they lived among the Eastern people for many years, perhaps even centuries, acting as teachers, guides, or quiet leaders, helping those who resisted the domination of Mordor. And then some readers imagine them as wandering guardians, moving from tribe to tribe, strengthening resistance wherever it could be found, and weakening Sauron's influence through patience rather than open confrontation. But Tolkien's later writings point towards another possibility. They may have succeeded quietly. not in a dramatic victory that appears in the Chronicles of Gondor, but in the slower work of preventing the East from uniting under the shadow. So, if their mission was to stir up the rebellion, like he said, and bring help to the few tribes that resisted Melkor worship, then their greatest victory might have been invisible to the historians of the West. Armies that never marched, alliances that never formed, kingdoms that never fully fell under Sauron's control. In other words, the Blue Wizards may have played a role in the defeat of Sauron that was never written down. And in some ways, that may be exactly the kind of story Tolkien intended, because throughout his legendarium, he reminds us that history often remembers the great kings and famous battles, but many of the most important acts of courage happen quietly, far from the places where chronicles are written. And if that was true in Middle-earth, then perhaps two of the most important figures in the war against Sauron are the ones whose names almost disappeared from the story. And that leads us to the final thought of tonight's episode, the Forgotten Heroes of Middle-earth. So we reach the end of the mystery. The story of the Blue Wizards leaves us with something both fascinating and strangely moving, I think. Because in the end, we never truly learn what happened to them. And I like that. I like that in songwriting, and I like it in this. Tolkien gives us their names. He gives us hints about their mission. He suggests they may have traveled deep into the East, helping people who resisted shadow and stirring rebellion against Sauron's growing power. But after that, their story just fades from the record. No great chronicles, nothing. No songs are sung about their victories. No king of Gondor records their deeds in the archives of Minas Tirith. They walk east, and history grows silent. But in many ways, I think the silence might be the point, right? Because Tolkien often wrote about the idea that the history does not record everything that truly matters. The great chronicles remember kings and famous battles, but countless smaller acts of courage happen far from the places where history is written. And we see that themed through Tolkien's stories, right? The hobbits, small and overlooked, changing the fate of the world. Quiet acts of loyalty and friendship, proving stronger than armies. Ordinary people doing their part without ever expecting recognition. And the Blue Wizards may represent the same idea on a larger scale. Two wanderers moving through distant lands, fighting a war that the West never even realized was happening, encouraging resistance, preventing alliances, helping the few who refuse to bow to the shadow. And if Tolkien's later thoughts are correct, again, they may have helped prevent entire civilizations from falling completely under Sauron's rule. Their victories simply were never written down. And perhaps that is why Tolkien never finished their story. Because in a mythic world, just like in this real one, not every hero is remembered. Some battles are fought far from the pages of history, and some victories are known only to few who were there. And somewhere beyond the maps of Gondor and the Shire, Tolkien leaves us with the images of two blue-robed wanderers walking the long roads of the East, quietly fighting the shadow where no one in the West could see, forgotten by chronicles, but perhaps not forgotten by the world they helped to save, right? And that includes you. You're not forgotten. You may be a hero in this world more than you know through your faithful acts of love and kindness and service. Just being faithful, even though nobody knows your name. So that is the journey for tonight. If you enjoyed the episode of Pilgrims Grey Chronicles, make sure you follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss the next walk down the long road with us, please. I would really appreciate that. And if you found the episode interesting, the best way to help us is to let the show grow by sharing it with a friend or post it somewhere where others can discover it. Word of mouth is still the best way for these conversations to travel. It beats the algorithm when you do it. Just each one of you shares it somewhere. And so if you want to support us in different ways, like directly, you can go and to our link, buy me a coffee at Pilgrims Grey Chronicles. And again, at our website, pilgrimsgreychronicles.com. We're still building it. We'll have merchandise there eventually, music, other things. For now, it's just you can listen to the audio. And until next time, keep watching, keep asking questions. We don't always just do Tolkien, of course. We do world events, biblical events, strange things in the Bible. We plan to do current events next week, so please stay tuned and don't miss. Not only should you subscribe to the YouTube thing, so hit the bell so that you are notified when our episodes come out. One comes out every week, every Monday at 9 o'clock. So until then, good night, travelers, and Godspeed to all of you.